Hi, Internets. This is Julian Sanchez from the Cato Institute.
And this is Jamelle Bouie from the American Prospect.
And I guess the top of the headlines today are all about the next big WikiLeaks release, although I guess it's actually the Times appears to have separately obtained a bunch of these WikiLeaks materials, mostly pertaining to the detainees at Guantanamo Bay, and prompting WikiLeaks to sort of hurry up their own release of documents. And there's a variety of interesting stuff in there. Did you have something that grabbed your eye?
Well, I haven't had a chance to look at the WikiLeaks document dump, but I did read the big Washington Post story on sort of the Obama administration's attempts to close Guantanamo, and I found that completely fascinating.
Right.
It's sort of, at the risk of sounding like an Obama apologist, which I'm not, but I feel like I sometimes come close to that line. I think it's really important to understand the extent to which presidents aren't as powerful as we tend to think in popular imagination, and that oftentimes they're constrained by a whole host of issues, a whole host of interests within and without the administration, and sort of the general priorities of their party and electoral organizations. And so, with the Washington Post piece, you really see the extent to which, what was initially a priority for the administration gradually went down the list of fell down the list of priorities as the administration was focused on bigger issues like healthcare reform. There's a part during in the piece where Obama's advisors tell the president that if we really press some of these congresspeople on Guantanamo, we may be jeopardizing our other priorities. And I think that really sort of captures what is difficult about presidential decision making, what's hard to understand or grasp about presidential power.
Well, the flip side is, I mean, it's very hard for me to think of an issue in the national security domain where Bush really wanted to do something but it was just too difficult politically. I mean, with Democratic majorities at various points in the administration. So, on the other hand, that's a sort of feature of that administration, which I don't think is a fit subject for imitation. So maybe right. I should be glad he's been less successful. Still, I do know people who are saying now that the president is constrained in all these ways and all these limits. I find more plausible in domestic politics than in the national security arena, where it's the evidence that they are seriously constrained. I mean, if you look at Libya, there was a sort of backlash after he sort of intervened there, sort of explaining to, I guess, sort of making the case to the UN kind of before he got around to telling us what was going on.
Right.
And people sort of fussed about it, but no one really sort of seriously believes that Congress is actually going to sort of assert its prerogative to pull support out. So I find this is sort of the domain in which I find those kinds of claims least plausible. That said, it also seems like it became increasingly clear that closing down Guantanamo had come to mean this sort of purely symbolic. We will put these people somewhere else, no
right.
longer called Guantanamo. Whether or not there's any sort of substantive change, is less obvious. What comes out for me from the stuff that was released, though, is just how sort of thin the bases of the risk assessments were on both sides. That is, they didn't have much ground for thinking that people were really a serious risk, and they didn't have much basis for thinking the ones that they let go were definitely not a threat. There obviously conservatives like to sort of cite these cases of people who went. They always say back to the battlefield. I consider it pretty possible that after 6 years in detention, you even if you didn't hate the U.S. before, you probably do by the end of it. That said, there are these cases where a guy turned out to be a Pakistani militant rather than the innocent Afghan conscript he claimed to be. and so I get the conservative sort of take on this is always, aha, and therefore, you should keep all these guys because look what a risk it is to let them go. My sort of read is, so by luck, essentially, we got this guy who turned out to be a dangerous militant, but we had no idea who he was.
Right.
We had not the first inkling. So by sheer luck, we might have prevented him from committing further acts of terror had we kept him. But in a sense, by sheer luck, we could just round up thousands of people,
right.
On that level of ignorance about whether or not they pose a risk. But I mean, so it's on the one hand, it seems like there's like a weird kind of framing effect where once you've got them, then if you let them go and it turns out that they're dangerous, well then that becomes a sort of example that comes back to bite you on the ass. Whereas if you just fail to pick up someone that you have no reason to believe is this dangerous militant, that somehow doesn't count. But once you've got them, even if you have exactly the same level of evidence about their culpability or their level of risk, then it becomes this huge embarrassment to let them go. But you see, they're on the basis of essentially a total lack of evidence. There are these attempts that come out in these papers to figure out whether someone is a threat on the basis of, do they have a watch that might indicate that they were attended an Al-Qaeda training camp where a lot of people got these watches, and it almost becomes this kind of Kafkaesque pretending to have memory problems is an interrogation resistance tactic. Claiming to be a simple cook or something is a resistance tactic, and you go, well, but what if you happen to be a cook and like that watch? Anyway, so it's interesting to sort of watching them strain in this sort of deficit of information to read these tiny little signals or these very dubious sudden recollections that, oh yes, I saw this guy at an Al-Qaeda training camp many years ago, and turn them into these hugely significant bases for deciding whether someone was going to be detained or transferred or freed. It almost has almost like kind of a mystical sort of super, magical thinking kind of quality to it. So you're looking for omens. Like was the first word I heard when the radio turned on this morning positive, and this, is the crack in the sidewalk look like a skull? And this is very sort of weird roll the bones, read the tea leaves almost approach.
Right. And to go back to the WAPO piece for a bit, and maybe like to something you mentioned that like in national security, it doesn't seem like there are that many limits. I would also say that like when it comes to status quo forces, generally speaking, like if you want to expand the limits of the executive or what the executive can do, there aren't going to be that many points of opposition from sort of like Congress, like the people who are supposed to be the veto points, right? Mm-hmm. So like I think part of the problem the Obama administration ran into was that on this one thing they wanted to do, like they wanted actually to walk back, and they initially wanted to walk back from a prior, more expansive position, and sort of like, Congress in all of its, craven fear of everything, of any possible electoral consequences, was like, no, we like this expansion because it helps, keep up our national security cred. And sort of to bring it back to that Kafkaesque way in which detainees were processed or trying to figure out whether they're dangerous, like that's going to continue for as long as I think Congress perceives, something like Guantanamo is necessary to protect themselves from charges of being soft on terror or something like that. That charge, soft on terrorism, is still a salient one in American politics. And this was ultimately the thing that I find extremely distressing still. That, like, for any headway to really be made on sort of walking back from the Bush administration, there needs to be some level of public support for this on both sides. You need to have some non-trivial number of Democrats and Republicans who believe that, like, maybe we shouldn't be afraid of the terrorists every waking moment of our lives. And there doesn't really seem to be the political space for saying that. if at least, or at least if you're very prominent, if you're a prominent politician, like saying that it's not going to get you any votes, at least not from people who wouldn't already have voted for you.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting how I mean, this is obviously well-worn territory, but it is interesting how there's this sort of unique character to the terror threat where the way we treat the risk of terrorism is sort of wildly disproportionate to the way we treat every other kind of risk. I mean, in general, if you talk about environmental harms, conservatives will usually be the first ones to rail against what's called the precautionary principle, this idea that essentially if there's any sort of downside risk, if there's a large but very tiny downside risk of some kind of environmental catastrophe, you sort of err on the side of prohibiting, and they sort of say, well, this is just sort of economically ruinous in the sphere of economic regulation, environmental regulation, because there's always some downside risk, and yet we don't. And we do seem sort of wildly unable to evaluate risks in the domain of terror in some way that's really proportionate or that makes some kind of sense in terms of the costs we're willing to bear to mitigate other kinds of risks. I mean, you look at I think TSA is an interesting case here. I'm pretty sure that essentially there has never been a successful detonation of an explosive device on a domestic U.S. flight.
I don't think there has, no.
So the idea that we're sort of ratcheting up security on domestic flights when in particular with this idea of like looking for bombs, because the reinforcement of the cockpit doors and the fact that passengers would just no longer allow it to happen mean that the repeat of the 9/11 scenario where people with X-Acto knives or box cutters are able to commandeer the plane, that's sort of no longer really a very serious concern, I think. So the security is basically at this point geared toward explosive devices. And the question was, what is it about the previous? Why do you think the previous security was unacceptable, given that this is a harm that has never actually successfully been carried off on a domestic flight? And what and sort of at what level do you say? Well, so the enormous extra burden of all these pat downs and extra screenings and expensive machines just is hard to justify, given that the previous security does seem to have effectively prevented this kind of harm, at least from occurring before. It's not remotely clear in any kind of scientific way how much marginal added security benefit you get from all this stuff, which is hugely costly, which does probably actually cost lives insofar as it deters people from flying, makes people drive more, and driving is more dangerous. And it's just, there's just not any real sign of an attempt to, in any rigorous way, evaluate the costs and the risks in a way that we do in every other. And again, it's usually sort of conservatives who are pushing in the regulatory sphere to say, we shouldn't just have, don't just impose this regulation because, clean air sounds good, or spotted owls sound good. Do some kind of serious analysis of the costs and the benefits, and see whether it's clear that you get enough of the good outcome you're aiming at to be worth the burden of the regulation. And you don't even see. I mean, it's not that you don't see it done well or that it's done poorly. There doesn't even seem to be an effort to do it, and I'm not entirely sure why that is.
I'm not. This is something I've been trying to figure out too, and part of me thinks that a trivial number of policymakers or lawmakers or whatever might be thinking something along the lines of this, that these TSA procedures, these things are, and a whole host of things are burdensome, they're intrusive, so on and so forth. But if there is another 9/11, things will get dramatically worse, right? Civil liberties are already teetering right now. Another major terrorist attack would just send things into the toilet. And so at the very least, this sort of moderate level of civil liberties violation is preferable to a high level one. Now the other, of course, the
flip side is if there's an attack anyway, they go, God, even this level of over the top, sort of security theater wasn't enough, so therefore more.
Right, I mean, like, yeah.
I mean, it depends on how much you believe the probability of a future terror attack is actually affected by, the sort of the outlays at the margin here, or the restrictions at the margin here. My sense is probably not a whole lot. In which case,
I mean, I would agree that, like, whether or not someone who really wants to blow something up is probably going to be able to do it. It's sort of my sort of like general take on these things.
One possibility is it's sort of a signaling thing, right? I mean, so if you're talking about trying to reduce the risk of car accidents or environmental catastrophes or whatever they are, right? I mean, that is a non-strategic interaction. That's just like a sort of parametric risk mitigation, sort of calculus. Whereas when you're dealing with an actual human adversary, there's some sense in which just sort of displaying a kind of unlimited willingness to expend resources, it could be said to have some kind of deterrent effect. It's not clear to me that's not actually at some level the point, but that's one possible reason for the difference. I gotta say, it's sort of slightly orthogonally here in terms of the most recent releases. I'm wondering. It seems as though every release so far, every big release they've had at this point, has been something that is at least apparently linked to Bradley Manning. If you go by the conversations Bradley Manning and Adrian Lamo had, it looks like they discussed this huge cache of State Department cables that eventually came out. Again, whether or not he was the source of that particular leak, but let's just say it seems like there's a pretty good chance that he was the source of those. He appears to have discussed this sort of big Guantanamo cache. I think there may be one other release involving a video from an airstrike in Afghanistan, but so far the big headline-grabbing WikiLeaks releases we've seen in the last year and a half have been stuff that seems reasonably probable was linked to Manning's efforts. And so one question is, if he is, he's sort of out of the way, and he's just been transferred to Leavenworth, as I recall, after sort of claimed that they were confident that he was being treated well, but they sort of transferred him anyway after sort of a level of international outcry, including incidentally a denial of an unsupervised visit from a UN Special Rapporteur on torture. This is apparently something that is an unconscionable failure of transparency and respect for human rights when other countries do it, but we're special. And in any event, it seems like the Manning well, again, assuming these things did come from him, maybe dry. At which point you wonder, is WikiLeaks as an institution the kind of revolutionary sort of threat or fount of transparency, depending on your perspective, or was it that they got a lucky break with one guy who had a ton of material and that's it? It's also interesting. Security procedures have changed, obviously, within the U.S. government as a result of these leaks. And I'm wondering whether some of the sort of grand claims that have been made about the era of WikiLeaks are not a lot. No one was talking about the era of Daniel Ellsberg. It was like this one guy did this thing, and people sort of debated that, but at some level it was recognized that this was about a kind of unusual decision by a guy who thought that his conscience would no longer allow him to preserve the classification of this sort of incendiary document, and everyone understood. It was about that one guy's decision, not about some kind of huge shift in the architecture. Now, obviously, part of the reason people do talk about the era of WikiLeaks is whether or not you have this institution or successors like OpenLeaks, the fact that you can now anonymously transmit huge amounts of data in a way that's been... Right.
The idea of the era of WikiLeaks, I think, has to do with the fact that no longer... it is both just for individual people, leaking things to other organizations, but it's the mere fact existence of these organizations. In the era of Daniel Ellsberg, it was major, with the Washington Post, New York Times, like major newspapers. And now it's like these large, amorphous, web-based organizations that can sort of exist indefinitely, that don't really need, I mean, they obviously want to support themselves, but sort of they can exist free form until another leak is made or something to that extent.
Mm-hmm. I mean, so on the one hand, you do see. I mean, if you look at this great documentary called "The Most Dangerous Man in America" about Ellsberg, you see like the incredible, the sort of the physical difficulty. It's sort of ridiculous now to think about, but like, the guy spent days or weeks taking, sheafs of documents small enough to hide, in a valise to take home and then Xerox, sort of physically mimeograph these copies of it that he then had to physically get to the Washington Post and the New York Times. And if, he was worried that if one copy got seized or blocked by a paper that lost its nerve, he would have to make sure he could get a copy to another paper. I mean, so the logistics of it were again, almost comical kind of in retrospect when you think about, the almost equally comical vision of Bradley Manning with a falsely labeled Lady Gaga CD, sort of putting it into the computer, like pretending to be bopping along listening to music when he was actually, burning all these discs. But it was obviously, again, just a very hugely different thing. On the other hand, Ellsberg did manage to get that stuff out, and the big incumbent, dead tree paper publishers managed to get it out too. We don't know who might have wanted to do the same but didn't. But I'm just wondering if at some level the supply side isn't much more a determinant than than in a sense the platforms that enable. So the WikiLeaks institution might make it marginally easier to get this stuff out, but at some level the real constraint here is the willingness of people with access to decide this thing needs to get out.
You still need people to make that choice to transmit information that jeopardizes their careers, jeopardizes their livelihoods, so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm. Which
is, it's a hard,
Well, though it's the same. It's in a way it's the same thing as the Gitmo thing. If you do nothing, even if you think you've got evidence that there's some kind of serious malfeasance or whatever. If you do nothing, then you're one of thousands of people with access to it. It's not like you can feel like, well, it's not my responsibility to call attention to this or try to stop it. Someone else can do that. Whereas if you are the one who leaks and it has bad consequences, if some informant is killed or something as a result, then you feel a very direct and personal responsibility. So again, there's this kind of asymmetry where, again, if you fail to round up thousands of people on the basis of no evidence, well, who could have known that one of them was a militant? If you have rounded up thousands of people with no evidence, then if you make the decision to release one, even if there's no reason to keep him, like you always sort of wonder, God, well, it's my fault for releasing him. I took the action. It's this sort of acts and omissions split. I don't know. Yeah. So, do you have any kind of final thoughts on Gitmo and or WikiLeaks?
I don't. But we can move on to the other sort of, I guess, like broad. Would you include this generally under the umbrella of what we're talking about, like really broadly defined?
Include the iPhone thing?
Yeah.
Or I think this is in a big sense that it'll be. Yeah. Circuitously apparent in a moment. So there was the big story last week was, or a big story if you're a huge geek, was a discovery by several researchers of what I think had been a long time sort of open secret in the security forensics community, that the iPhone keeps this sort of 1 year, rather precise latitude, longitude, location log of everywhere you go. Basically, with your iPhone and your iPad, I guess they know right now where I'm talking to you. At least they do. If any GPS service is active.
They don't know, right? Like I think what was lost in sort of the outrage almost was that both the iPhone and iPad, these are local files, and there isn't any evidence they transmit to any like central servers. So they're sort of just like I mean, they're logs. They're location logs that exist on your phone or on your computer, which has its own problems and complications.
Right.
And, Apple should have to... Go ahead.
So there are a couple of things. So one, actually, there was a statement they made, their general counsel made about a year ago in response to, I think, queries from either Congress or the FTC, where they did discuss keeping some kind of database of non-individually identified geographical information. So some of this may be transmitted to Apple. Assuming that statement from a year ago is truthful, it may be that what is retained by Apple is not the kind of detailed information that is retained in the log.
Right.
That's not entirely clear. What I found interesting was that I think people got very upset or very worked up because, one of the things the researchers did, even though, again, they weren't the first ones to notice this, actually, but they released this program where you could plug your phone in and download and read the log, and not only that, plot it on a map. So you could actually see this incredibly detailed sort of map of everywhere
right.
you've been over the past year. And some people just sort of said, well, isn't that really cool?
Others
are very freaked out, but it
people
was
who said, isn't that really cool?
No, and I'm in the same boat. My girlfriend actually read something about this, sort of saying it was funny because we had lived in the same city for many years, had some friends in common, and we actually never really met until we were living in different cities. She sort of said, well, wouldn't it be funny to sort of like go back and trace all the times we almost met? When were we in the same place at the same time, at the same concert, or at the same restaurant, or the same whatever? And how closely did we miss having met a year earlier? And that is kind of cool. But the interesting to me is that right, your cell provider and Google, there's lots of companies that actually probably retain roughly the same kind of information. If they didn't before, they're increasingly doing so for a bunch of reasons.
Just in general, if you're carrying around a GPS-enabled device in which you use on a regular basis, I'm going to guess that device is collecting some sort of location information on you. I never imagined otherwise, which might explain my sort of total non-surprise at this. My Apple keeps track of where I go, my iPhone keeps track of where I go. Doesn't every GPS-enabled cellular device do that?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's dangerous to assume that everyone who carries a phone is. I think geeks assume this, and probably normal people don't.
Yeah, this is a good point.
And there's some empirical work on this that suggests that indeed most people are not conscious of the fact that their phone is sort of certainly not that it's doing this in a remotely stored way. It's actually an interesting question, which is sort of more upsetting. On the one hand, the remotely stored location information, that is the information AT&T or Verizon have about your physical movements, is something that can be accessed in a way, sort of without your control. That is, either the government or some bad actor within the company,
or advertisers,
or an advertiser, could decide that they're going to start keeping tabs on people's movements, and you would sort of have no way of knowing or controlling that, as opposed to the phone that's in your in your physical control. On the other hand, the fact that the file is unencrypted means that anyone who gets physical access to your phone, potentially is able to extract this data. And I'm almost more. That almost seems like as more of a worry than something that's locked in a database at AT&T, which is probably going to ask for, they're going to ask for some kind of court order, or are going to be worried about liability. At any rate, they're not just going to misplace it in a way I might misplace my phone.
And even sort of generic, even if it's only generic information, if it's generic information that's being collected, there's no way to tell who it actually belongs to.
Well, in theory, there's actually been a lot of interesting work done about. So you assume they're still going to have a unique identifier. Well, it depends how the information is kept. It turns out there's a lot of research suggesting that it is really actually incredibly easy to re-identify supposedly anonymized data if you have other data sets to use as your basis. So, for example, if you have any kind of unique identifier that is persistent for latitude and longitude over time. I mean, it's not that hard to figure. Gosh, someone who keeps showing up at the American Prospect every day. Maybe that's someone who works at the. I mean, you can narrow these things down.
Right.
If it's just how many. If it's just a raw count, how many phones are at this cell tower at this time? That's pretty hard to de-anonymize.
Also, I'll say, just wanted to say real quickly about the difference in having the information on your phone unencrypted and sort of like in a database somewhere. I feel like that would only be, in terms of someone getting to it, it'd only be really a concern for law enforcement, right? Like, I wager that the average person not only knows about this controversy, but like even if they had some faint idea that they get your location data from your phone, they would have to like actually put an effort to like extract it from your phone.
Well, there is an interesting case I think in Michigan where the ACLU has essentially filed a FOIA request because it turns out that police have these portable devices they keep in their cars, which can be used to basically you just plug it into a smartphone and it does a full dump. And if you start
that is worrisome. Yeah. I find that a lot more problematic. I find the thing with the iPhone far more problematic in light of something like that.
Mm-hmm. Right. No, this is the kind of thing that it's when you sort of combine these two stories. This also came out last week, and so part of the problem. I mean, it's not clear exactly what circumstances are doing this. There's something called the search engine to arrest doctrine, which means that if you're arresting someone, and just remember you can arrest someone for like not having their seatbelt buckled, or
right.
lots of low-level offenses are technically arrestable. It's not that hard to come up with a pretext to arrest someone. And the doctrine says basically you get to search someone's person. And the idea is to prevent them from destroying evidence or to make sure they're not armed as a kind of safety precaution without a warrant. When we start having our entire sort of personal contact lists, maybe months and months, if not years, of email history, all sort of stored on these devices we're carrying around with us. And then you add to that, oh, by the way, also, you didn't even know it, but there's a file that shows basically everywhere you've been for the last year in some detail. You start sort of worrying about how that little sort of exception can be expanded into a hugely intrusive search. And that's assuming they're only doing this incident to arrest. I mean, part of what the ACLU wants to find out is, are they just borrowing, are they just saying, do you mind if I look at your phone and sort of dumping the information? And they've been fighting that. I think they wanted to charge the ACLU like $500,000 to process documents, but I'm curious to see how this policy has been carried out and how the technology is being used. So are you an iPhone guy? Are you an iPhone?
I'm an iPhone guy. I have an iPhone. I have an iPad. So I actually, when I learned that there's a program in which you map the data, actually, I plugged it in and turned on and ran the program, and it was really accurate. Like even, I'm actually sort of impressed with the level of accuracy and ability, because from what I understand, it's not actually GPS coordinates. It triangulates your position based on available cell towers. Mm-hmm. So a few weeks ago, I was driving up from Asheville, North Carolina, and driving from Asheville, if you go just straight north, you're driving through Tennessee somewhat, where my reception was horrible, if not non-existent. And it got, like when I got reception back, it seems. Mm-hmm. And then the brief patches where I had reception, it pinpointed that I was there, driving randomly through Tennessee briefly. It was a really cool map. Like I'm semi-bothered by it all, but I'm sort of a geek for data.
I mean, the interesting thing about the signal strength is as long as you've got contact to enough towers, even if it's really weak, the fact of how weak it is actually is data that can be used with some precision to calculate your distance from the towers. So you actually you get a certain ability to calculate precision with precision to location, even when the signal is actually not strong enough to have a very good phone conversation.
It's funny. Some of the locations were totally off. Like I knew where I was at that time, and it was not where it had me. But others were just pinpoint. One of the little dots was a house. I was visiting while my girlfriend was house sitting for this couple, and I went to their house to see her. And it was like just pinpointed that house like right at the time where I was there, and that was crazy. That is insane.
Slightly unsettling. So this is actually an interesting thing that's going to the courts. I know the Justice Department just filed a Supreme Court cert petition from a ruling involving not cell phones, but basically a GPS tracking device that was planted on a suspect's car. There actually is sort of statutory requirement for a court order to be obtained before a tracking device is installed, but they basically sort of didn't follow the warrant. They could have kept tracking after the warrant had expired and installed it after the time period. In some ways, they didn't follow the warrant's specified procedures, so there's this remaining question of whether there was a Fourth Amendment interest in location privacy, because the Fourth Amendment has an exclusionary remedy. That means, so if the evidence is illegally obtained, it cannot be used in court, whereas the statutory requirement does not have an exclusionary remedy, so it still sort of requires them to decide this question. And there's actually a very novel theory the court came up with, according to which, essentially, even though, so the idea here was that observing someone, at least in public, and there's a tracking device on a car, is not a Fourth Amendment search in general, because you're going out in public where anyone can see you. And so you can't reasonably expect that that's private. And the court actually has an interesting step, which was you don't have an expectation of privacy in where you are at any given moment, but you might have an expectation of privacy in the entire aggregate pattern, the mosaic of your movements over a long period. And the argument here the reasoning was, look, you expect that anyone might see you in public at any moment, but to actually follow you around and know where you're going 24 hours a day for a month requires intensive and expensive surveillance that even police forces generally actually can't afford to carry out, except by these technological means. So actually, a reasonable person does have an expectation of privacy, not that they won't be seen by anyone at any time in public, but that they won't be seen by the same person constantly in public for 2 months.
I mean, that seems intuitively correct to me.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's sort of, that's really as much as I have to say, right? Like, if I run into someone, if there's someone I don't want to see, but I run into them in public, okay, whatever, I had no real expectation I would never run into this person in public. Mm-hmm. But if I notice that this person is following me everywhere, and sort of like, wherever I go, this person is there, then I begin to feel my privacy being violated. Not because, like you said, that I have any real personal expectation that no one I don't like will ever see me in public, but that the fact that they know my movements, they have information about me that is sort of separate from my location at a given point in time, but more, they know my patterns, they know where I'm going, and that is, it's a trope in all kinds of movies, right? Like when the threatening drug lords want to show that like they can kill your family, they tell you the movements your family makes on a daily basis.
Here are the photographs of your daughter at the playground. Yeah.
Right. Like it's saying that like well, the invasion of privacy isn't that the drug dealers sell your family. It's that like they know what your family is doing on a regular basis at any given point in time.
Right. They have that sort of ability to we have this weird. I think our whole this is like something I've sort of working on for a long time in a more general way, but that we have this sort of very broken dichotomy of public and private, certainly in the law. It doesn't really track what we intuitively mean by those strips. So, if I go to the drugstore and buy a pack of condoms, that's obviously a public event. I'm in a public place in front of a bunch of people. There's a practical sense in which it's private, in that none of these people know who I am or care who I am. They're not following me out of the drugstore to see who I'm having dinner with later and whether we leave separately or together. The idea of public and private is a binary as opposed to a relational thing and this is something the legal scholar Helen Nissenbaum has written about pretty compellingly, is just a sort of wild disconnect between the way we sort of naturally and intuitively govern our lives and the way the law does it, which has always been this very binary. It's public or it's private, and once it's public in any way, there's this incredibly sharp disconnect from probable cause, ex ante warrant is required to nothing is required, and we're sort of in this process of trying to figure out where location information fits. And there's just a whole bunch of contexts in which I think technology is, in a way that the courts are not really necessarily recognizing yet, creating problems, not just because the technology is new, but because it tracks people in ways that don't fit this binary, and so are not easily accommodated. So the law ends up kind of, if you apply the existing framework, it just gives you the wrong answer. Speaking of cell phone tracking, I know one of the more famous instances of cell phone tracking.
I was just about to make that transition. Check that one out there. I was literally about to come out of my mouth, but continue, please.
No, I was going to say is of course Bruce Wayne at the end of The Dark Knight uses like Apple, covertly installed echolocation software to discover where the Joker is hiding out. So what can we expect next from The Dark Knight?
This I feel like I'm blogging as I'm developing a casting news for superhero movies beat. But for what's the new movie called? It's like the Dark Knight
Rises, I think.
Rises, there we go. The Dark Knight Rises. The Dark Knight Rises, the latest casting news is that Joseph Gordon-Levitt, who was in Nolan's most recent film, Inception, will also be in The Dark Knight Rises as a police officer. Originally, when rumors were being floated that he was going to be Catch, everyone thought he would play Alberto Falcone, who was a character in...
I heard the Riddler for a while was one of the rumors, too.
Yeah, it was the Riddler, then Alberto Falcone, who was a character in 2 older Batman graphic novels. But he's just playing some random detective, which makes me hopeful personally that Nolan is drawing some inspiration from the Gotham Central series, which was sort of like Law and Order in Gotham City. Batman is sort of not really seen. Villains occasionally are, but mostly it's sort of like how does the Gotham City Police Department operate in a world where your partner, like, opening the wrong door could result in Mr. Freeze freezing your partner and
Right. Well, it's not like, although it's that radically different. So this is, in a lot of ways, it sounds like, I think I've read one or two. Is this the one where the district attorney, who is also Manhunter on the side, is like a backup character? Or am I thinking of something else?
I think you might be thinking of something else.
Okay.
This is like very straight-laced. Like, it really does read like a graphic novelization of a Law and Order series.
Okay. So this is like, this is sort of the same premise as Brian Michael Bendis' Powers.
Right. It's very similar. I think Powers is probably the better series. But you're right. It's very similar in feel to Powers. Which, if I remember correctly, Powers is getting an FX show, isn't it?
Oh, is that right? Oh, I think I heard something like that. That could be great or it could be horrible, depending on... Do you know who they've cast?
I don't know they've cast anyone yet. I know Katie Sackhoff from Battlestar Galactica wants to be cast as the female lead, whose name I just forgot.
That would be... I'm forgetting that, too. Christian Walker and Deanna Pilgrim, that's right.
Yeah.
Very kind of heavy-handed. Bendis is not subtle in his allegorical namings at all. But although she's like, I could see it actually.
I could see it too.
They need like a sort of huge dude to get the sort of proportions between the two leads right.
I'm looking forward to. I'm sure looking forward to that big show. I'm looking forward to the new Batman movie. I'm looking forward to the Captain America movie. I'm sure looking forward to I like this trend of taking superhero movies out of like the superhero genre and putting them into other types of media. So Captain America is a World War II movie that like contains superheroes, or the next X-Men movie is kind of a Cold War thriller that contains superheroes. And I hope this continues.
Well, I think the reason for it is that what you see in the comic realm is that you have just like, almost like a weird fluke of historical path dependence. You have these huge fictional universes with all these resources growing up around them. The DC and the Marvel universes, right? And then when someone else wants to, so like for like decades, basically, like horror kind of, it's like so superhero comics were dominant. And then if you want to tell a different kind of story, a war story or a horror story or a detective story, in the context of one of these two companies, you just end up being so like the Sandman, right? I mean, Neil Gaiman's Sandman is not a superhero book, but it's set at Vertigo, and so it by happenstance exists in the same universe as like Martian Manhunter and the Swamp Thing. So it ends up being superheroes and I guess that doesn't really apply to Powers, which is like sort of its own spin-off thing. But again, I think almost like a fluke is that you get the people sort of doing the comic stories, saying, well, I don't want to tell. I'm interested in telling this different kind of story, not a superhero story, except I'm sort of now constrained to do it in a universe full of superheroes, and there's a certain iconic power to that. So, I'll try and incorporate it while still being able to tell this kind of straight. This sort of straight story in another genre. It's like Jonah Hex. It's part of the same universe as Green Lantern.
Yeah, which that didn't even occur to me for a long time until a Justice League Unlimited episode, Justice League episode where Jonah Hex showed up. And I was like, oh, that makes sense. Yeah.
Well, and there are these little links. So, like, Jonah Hex used to fight with a guy called Scalp Hunter, and Scalp Hunter was reincarnated in the early '90s Starman as one of the O'Dares. He was like a kind of corrupt cop. Who was friends with the Shade and Starman. Spoiler alert, sorry, for anyone who hasn't gotten around to reading Starman yet, but like really you should. It's fantastic, especially the first like 2 volumes of the omnibus. That's another one I'm kind of shocked hasn't like been like spun off into a miniseries yet. So yeah, I don't know. I think that's sort of why you see that. I don't know what are superheroes? I wrote like a long article for the Prospect years ago about sort of why political allegories often don't really work in superhero comics for various reasons that have to do with sort of the constraints of the genre, and I will not rehearse that old argument here. But I'm wondering how well do you think this works?
Sorry, how long do I think?
How well does it work to do a police procedural like plus superheroes?
I don't know. I think it works. I think the key to doing this doing these sorts of things is to not take the perspective of the superheroes themselves. Mm-hmm. That these stories should be about normal people that exist. That these stories should be taking the conceit that this is a world full of superheroes very seriously and be about the normal people who exist within them. And you have to imagine. I feel like this is an area ripe for storytelling because there are all sorts of our normal world that are just drastically affected by the presence of large numbers of superpowered beings. Mm-hmm. Not just crime fighting, sort of the insurance industry. Mm-hmm. How does an insurer or a business owner even make a livelihood in a place like Metropolis, where every other week some horrible creature is demolishing a third of the city?
Mm-hmm. Or Magneto, yeah.
I would read the story about the insurance agent, the Metropolis Insurance Agency, that has to charge outrageous premiums to even come close to making a profit.
Isn't the dad from The Incredibles an insurance agent, actually?
Yeah, he is. He is the dad from The Incredibles. The Incredibles did a really good job of this because, the thing the opening thing driving the story forward is the existence of the government agency that relocates former superheroes after after Congress passes the law outlawing mass vigilantism.
Right.
I don't know. I
find so weird. I find it so weird that in the comics, this the idea that and this is again something I sort of ran through an article, but the idea that an attempt to like register people who want to like put on costumes and like beat people up, or people who like have the ability to like read minds or like control minds, or I mean, like it's only because like clearly like an oncoming police state. If the government is trying to register these things, and it's like, on what? I mean, we don't let you dress up in a costume and beat people up. That's not like. Right,
it's not abridging your freedom to say that this is not. If you're going to do it, we understand that you have like some enormous power that lets you do this like with relatively little harm to your own person. So if you're going to do it, you should at least get an ID card.
Something like that. Or at the same time, there are these stories where in one of Whedon's, Joss Whedon's run on Astonishing X-Men, there's a story about this kid who like turns 13 and just like totally out of his control, his mutant powers activate. His mutant power, unfortunately, is to like emit this sort of totally lethal death toxin that just wipes out the entire population of his town. And like he's sort of like found by Wolverine like hiding in a cave somewhere, and he's like, look, sorry kid, but if they find out a mutant did this, we're screwed. And so he offs the kid again. Sorry, spoiler alert. But it does make you sort of realize that like they've got this attempt to have this allegory in the X-Men comic. Where first it was like a race thing, and then it was like a sort of sexual orientation thing, where the Mutant Registration Act is like the stand-in for this sort of political bigotry against some despised minority group. And it's sort of, you're like, okay, this is interesting as an allegory, but the second you actually take it seriously and say, if when you turned 13, like some percentage of the population might just without any ability to control it, become just incredibly lethal to people around them, like, do we really think the government would not make some attempt to identify those people so that that could be prevented, and that this would be a fascist thing if it happened? I just think, of course we would do that. I mean, at least if we're talking again about like accidentally killing your entire town, or exploding like a kind of human nuclear bomb or something. So anyway,
we had this conversation in the Prospect offices, and I think the compromise position was that something like mutant registration, which is registering someone based on the circumstance of their birth, almost like they have no control over this. Mm-hmm. This is who they are. Might be unconstitutional, or at least is deeply unethical. Was something like superhero registration, which is simply someone who makes an affirmative action to dress up in a costume and fight crime. Though, like registering them so that the government knows who they are is like not dissimilar from say registering a gun.
Mm-hmm. I think it depends at some level on the level of. I mean, I think to me it's sort of crucial that in a lot of these cases, the mutant powers are. I mean, so the way mutant powers are always presented in the comics is that like you have to go to Xavier school to learn how to control them. Otherwise, you might end up like Scott Summers, right? If you didn't have that ruby quartz, he just opens his eyes and wham, he starts wrecking everything. And so, I mean, so again, if the model is you have these incredible powers and they manifest without warning and can be incredibly destructive, and you didn't even know you had them, and that's a situation where I would tend to say you could make the case for some kind of advance. I mean, you would actually have to have obviously all sorts of procedural safeguards in place to protect people's privacy, and but in the same way that we quarantine people who through no, I mean, a happenstance that you have caught a plague pathogen. It's not about who you are exactly. It's not genetically intrinsic to you, although genetics might have something to do with your susceptibility to it. But though it's not your fault, we say, look, you can't control this, but you are potentially dangerous to others through this sort of biological fact that is not your fault. Nevertheless, we accept that at least during conditions of epidemic, it's okay to say, look, I'm sorry, but we have to confine you so you are not a danger to others, even though it's not your fault that you're a danger to others. So I think, I mean, again, depending on the facts of how many mutants there are and how lethal they tend to be when they manifest, you could make a similar judgment. Because it sounds very unlibertarian, I hope. Unfortunately, I don't think Cato has like a position on the Mutant Registration Act, so I don't have to worry that I'm like running against the line. At least it should be at the state level. I think we can agree. Should decentralize the mutant, sort of a Ganosian enclave somewhere in Alabama. Anyway, I don't know. Sorry, I'm babbling.
No, it's okay. I think that's all. For today.
All right, that sounds good. All right, well, I will see you in the funny pages, as they say.
Yes. Good talking to you.
Catch you around.